Welcome to today's webcast, brought to you by Sandhill Consultants and ArchiMate. I'm Stephen Fegg, Director of Database Trends and Applications in Unisphere Research. I will be your host for today's broadcast. Our presentation today is titled Data Architecture, the Foundation for Enterprise Architecture. Before we begin, I want to explain how you can be a part of this broadcast. There will be a question and answer session. If you have a question during the presentation, just type it into the question box provided and click on the Submit button. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but if your question has not been selected during the show, you will receive an email response. Plus, one lucky viewer today will win a $100 American Express gift card. The winner will be announced at the end of the event, so stay tuned to see if it's you. Now, to introduce our speakers for today, Donald Soulsby, Vice President of Architecture Strategies at Sandhill Consultants, and Jeffrey Giles, Principal Architect at Sandhill Consultants. For more information on our speakers today, you can click on the arrows under their headshots. Now I'm going to pass the event over to Donald.
Thank you, Stephen. So today we're going to talk about data architecture and the foundation for enterprise architecture. And again, part of the impetus for enterprise architecture as a whole, it's about change. So I'll be speaking today. I am Don Soulsby, VP Architecture Strategies, as Stephen mentioned. And Jeff Giles, our Principal Architect, will be the other speaker. Robert Lutton, our VP and Chief Marketing Officer, will be on the line as well, and he will be there at the end if you have any other questions. So who are we, Sandhill Consultants? Well, we're a group of people, products, and processes, and we're all about data architecture, the process of good data management, and fundamentally the practice of data governance. And it's all around trusted data. And frankly, it's around to reduce risk and achieve compliance. So as we also talk today, we'll be showing you some information from our technology partner, which is Erwin. And primarily, erwin was known for many, many years as a data modeling tool. But as of March 2016, the company expanded to a private company and was able to acquire and now is integrating a number of other products in the areas of business process management and enterprise architecture. And we'll be showing you some of that today. So what is architecture? Well, as we know, it's about designing or constructing buildings. That's the critical one we've always heard about architecture itself. In fact, the two examples we'll be using today is about building architecture, but also shipbuilding, marine architecture. But the second context is more critical to what we do, and it's talking about the carefully designed structure of something like the chemical architecture of the human brain, or specifically, when dealing with our world, the conceptual structure and logical organization of a computer or computer-based systems. In other words, it's systems architecture that we're really going to be talking about. So going forward then, let's look at two examples of some really great architecture. One is the SS United States by the architect William Francis Gibbs. And the other one, of course, is the Guggenheim Museum in New York by the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. In both cases, and certainly as we mentioned in terms of the definition, architecture is about context. It's not the engineering of a building, but it's the conceptual design of the building. Elil Saarinen, a Finnish architect who was very instrumental in the early 20th century in America, has said that architecture is always defined by the thing that is in its next larger context. So if we look at what that picture denotes there, we see a chair in a room in a house in an environment, and an environment in a city plan. And the same is true of the architecture we do, because when we talk about pieces of architecture within that, we need to talk about the context within the system, within the network, within the organization, and we'll see examples of that as we go forward. One of the problems that we have, of course, is the legacy of the way systems have been built for 30-odd years. Typically, they were built in a top-down approach, either by organization or by process, by saying, well, we're going to start with this organization, like marketing or accounting, and we will build all of our systems around that function. And basically what happened then, as we start to build them, we got these silos of data. And the problem now is, of course, that the business has changed. And specifically, the business now needs to have information from each of the different silos. So the initial answer to that, of course, was something called enterprise application integration, which frankly just was, much like a 1930s phone operator, a bunch of 2 points that connected all the other points. And you can understand how complex that was getting. In fact, I have a friend of mine, an building architect friend of mine, who calls that the Italian school. The problem is that there's a real myth that there is business and technology, and we need to somehow figure out how to connect the two together. Well, the point is, there really only is the business, and everything that's there of the enterprise architecture must include the business, must be driven by the business. Well, why do we do it? There's only one fundamental reason why you need an enterprise architecture, frankly, and it's about change. And the only thing that's constant is change. Now, originally I thought that was a statement made by some French thinker in the 17th century, but it actually is a Greek philosopher back in 500 BCE. So we're really looking at two reasons why change needs to happen within any enterprise. And it's an external stimulus, which could come from, an example would be a statutory body, a regulatory body demanding that some things change. That external pressure, by the way, could also be from a partner or a consumer. And just as much so, there could be some need for internal change, whether it's something like a strategic decision to look at a merger or acquisition or a new product line. So the fact remains that impact analysis is really the critical aspect of why you need enterprise architecture. And if we look at it again from the risk management perspective, it could be about strategic risk, things that the company has decided to do to change their position in the marketplace. And frankly, of course, we've all seen it could very well be regulatory. But interestingly enough now, we see that risk management must also take into account the media. The whole notion of reputation loss, particularly when it comes to data breaches, has become quite prominent in the papers as we see today. And naturally, of course, with the growth of social media, the notion of a risk management perspective that comes from the actual consumers themselves. So if we look at the flip side of that, which is compliance, as we mentioned, we want to minimize risk, but we also want to achieve compliance, that in fact it could be statutory compliance, coming from some supervisory body, government agency, or it could in fact be something like a watchdog. But the flip side of that as well, it could be a commercial compliance. So if you're a member of a value chain in your organization, there are some things that you get from your partners and things you produce for other partners. And there were probably some service level agreements and notions of quality within that value chain. And of course, the last element we see on the commercial side is really related to the professional organizations going forward. So with that, I'd like to pass you.
Thank you, Donald. We're on to our first poll question today, and the question is, how many of you are using the following tools: PowerPoint, Visio, or EA Modeling Solution? And while you select your answer, if you're wondering who else is viewing this webinar today, we have representatives from the City of Dallas, the County of Jefferson, Husky IMS, White & Case LLP, NAV Canada, the Oregon Department of Transportation, Tufts University, Direct Energy, the Erickson Institute, Gordon Food Services, and many others. So we'll give you a few more seconds to select your answers. Okay, and it looks like the results are coming in. So it looks like 14.3% of you are using PowerPoint, 60.7% using Visio, and 25% using EA Modeling Solution. Back to you, Donald.
Thank you. Some interesting statistics in terms of the enterprise architecture. So as we start to look at the larger problem now of how do we do impact analysis, obviously things like Visio and PowerPoint make it less likely that you're going to be technologically assisted in being able to do that type of impact analysis as it relates to change. In fact, all of the change as it relates to it in enterprise architecture needs to come from a basic framework. And there are a number of really, really good ones out there. We have the federal agency, FIAC, TOGAF, which is from the Open Group. Poll Data is one that's been around for quite a few years. One of the Erwin products in the business processing world tends to use that one as well. And of course, there's the Zachman framework, which has been around since the late 80s, early 90s. And you'll all notice in each one of these, however, there is a fundamental notion of data. Interestingly enough, the first column in the Zachman framework is a data column, and we see right after the business architecture in FIAC, we see the data architecture. And over in TOGAF, we see it's a very early point in the discussion as we go forward. So we can see that through all the years, 20, 30-odd years that we've been doing enterprise architecture, the data has always been one of the principal components. In fact, if we look at enterprise architecture, classically as defined in the early 90s, it was something called DAT, Data, Application, and Technology. In fact, very early in John Zachman's writing, it actually was a 3-column framework. So it's about data, application, and technology initially. So if we start to look at a bit of that history now, the first thing we see, obviously late 80s, early 90s, was the notion of information engineering. We've been doing data models, obviously, since the mid to late 70s and all through the 80s, but we started to see that connecting two together, the data model and the process model, with this thing called CRUD, where data is created, reviewed, updated, deleted, gave us a huge potential of looking at how we manage information and how we manage how information is processed. As we move forward from there, we started to see, obviously, the growth of multi-tier service providers. And then in that particular sense, where we're dealing with client servers now, we're dealing with multi-tier, that we then had to look at where are these processes going to be performed. Some of them are going to be performed on a PC and a thick client. Some are going to be performed. And, of course, today now, obviously, with the information that's now in the cloud and the processing that's done in the cloud. So clearly there had to be a relationship between a process model and the network model. And a lot of the early days, technically, it was all about load balancing. Where is the most important place to do that? Well, the next layer was added was about access control, when people were starting to worry now about breaches coming in. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we started to look at the human interface model to see who and how could access the information through the network to get at the applications, but ultimately ended up at the data. So really, technically speaking, we have this more generalized associative model that we need to look at from an enterprise architecture perspective. And we need to look at the what, the how, the where, the when, and the who as an integrated model. We also have to look at the architectural layers. Looking at the Guggenheim Museum, what you see on the far left is the original sketch Frank Lloyd Wright did of his idea of how he wanted to build this new type of museum. Then, of course, it went to a bunch of technical specifications, the architectural drawings, and then had this operational view of what the actual object would look like in reality. So those three layers are critical to understand when we're dealing with enterprise architecture as well. So from that, we need to know that there was a conceptual model that represented those associations. We need to have that architectural model and the operational model. And in fact, the architectural models become that joining of the conceptual and the operational. Now, in traditional architecture, again, we would call this business, technical, and operational. And that's the point I was trying to make earlier, that the notion that there are these two solitudes of technology and business, I think, is false. I think there is one. It's the business. And we have to look at the abstract or the conceptual part of the business. We also have to look at the operational. And it's joining in the middle to these architectural models that will provide a great advantage for us. So if we want to look at this unified approach then, over the years they've developed this thing called the Enterprise Architecture Prime 6. These are the 6 basic primitive things that are associated with any architecture at a conceptual or abstract layer. And the what is the product, the how is the process, the where is the place, the when is the period, the who is a party, and ultimately, obviously, there's a purpose, there's a reason for doing that. So if I start to look at these different elements now, we see that that basic model of the 6 primes has a conceptual, operational, and architectural view. The conceptual view is precisely that. What products, which processes, which places, periods, and parties are involved in the design of the concept of what this enterprise or business is going to do to operate. And it's developed with the notion of having a basis on mission and objectives that fall into the purpose. The architectural view now, we start to speak to the specific architectures, and the products become data architecture, the processes application architecture, a network architecture for the locations, a cycle architecture for the periods, and a security architecture for the parties. Now, this is not, if you look at the last one on cycle architecture, this is not time. This is actual starts and finishes, like a year, a month, or a description like that. And you'll notice now that the purpose has moved to something called a capability. So we're going to direct the mission objectives of the organization into a set of capabilities. And down at the operational level, we now know it's actually physically data. We have applications that run on nodes of networks there is a life cycle associated with it, and ultimately the security that's provided for it. Now you'll notice the purpose icon has disappeared from this particular one, because at this time we should be fully operating at the capability we specified to the objectives and missions of the organization. And you'll notice now when we get to the operational view at the very bottom, we've added time. Time is actually the workspaces over time that says at a given point that entire model has a past and has a future, and if we're doing impact analysis once again, we need to look at the entire model and how it's all connected. So why are we doing all of this? Well, again, once again, we're looking to achieve compliance, whether it's regulatory or part of that value chain, but most importantly, we're really trying to limit unintended consequences. That a change in one area, whether it's in an application or a database in a technological environment, or something that happens in the business to decide where or what they wanted to change about the business, we do need to understand what the impact of all those changes are going to be. So from classic risk management, we understand that the first thing that needs to be done is the classification of the risks, followed by the valuation, detection, and mitigation associated with the risks.
Okay, and we're on to our second poll question today. How mature is your enterprise data management? You have a go-to person, a defined process, an enterprise-wide program, or not sure? We're going to give you a few seconds to select your answer. And again, if you have a question during the presentation, just type it into the question box provided and click on the Submit button. We're going to try to get to as many questions as possible, but if your question has not been selected during the show, you will receive an email response. Okay, we'll just give you a few more seconds. All right, and it looks like the results are coming in. 40.7% of you have a go-to person. 25.9% have a defined process. 22.2% an enterprise-wide program. And 11% are not sure. Back to you, Donald.
Thank you. The interesting part of these designations, at least on the first three, if you've ever heard of the CMMI Institute, they have their 5 scales, 1 to 5 on any level of maturity. In fact, we'll get into a little discussion a bit later about the DMM, which is a part of the CMMI's organization on the data management maturity. The first 3 questions that you saw there effectively will specify whether you're level 1, level 2, or level 3. In fact, when we go into an organization to do an assessment, if I see on somebody's cubicle go-to person, I can pretty much guess that they're mostly at a level 1 or trying to verge on level 2. Because level 1 is all about people. It's a people-driven process where you have these software heroes, that's what I heard called. And then as you move to level 2, you start to then say, well, that's not scalable. You know, we got a problem if that person leaves. So what we have to do is we have to define the process, and that's usually where you see the beginnings of an enterprise program start to happen as these things are developed. And then lastly, of course, is when you then have that fully scalable, sustainable program across the entire enterprise, you're effectively at the level 3s. Level 4s and 5s, again, do exist, but they're quite rare. And we found most organizations, as we've seen by the statistics there, tend to be between a level 1.5 and a level 2.5. So that's pretty much what we expect to see from the generalized numbers. So going back to that then, when we talk about building these programs, we need to talk about a sustained, scalable process by which we do things. And the first thing to do that fundamentally is to start looking at plans and blueprints. This is the architectural layer that I had mentioned that is kind of the crossing between the business side of the house and defined in the conceptual areas and the operational side of the house. And to understand them better, to get that sense of impact analysis, again, for the SS United States, you see the full set of plans that were there. The Guggenheim Museum, it was those architectural blueprints and such. And our starting point for enterprise architecture, we feel, should be that enterprise data model. And that's a place where you start to get the blueprints and to start to looking at the impact of change happening there. Now, the way we look at doing that is through something called concurrent data modeling. This is using the Erwin data modeling tool, and effectively now we see those same 3 layers, the conceptual, the architectural, and the operational. If something does happen and you want to know what's going on, the best thing you can do, obviously, is go to the databases, and from a forensic perspective, you can reverse engineer the information from the database into a physical data model. In the same way, you can go to your glossary or taxonomy, and if you want to look at some sort of preventive change management, there is a desired change to happen, the best place to go there is to look at the business terms. Is there something changing about the basic fundamental vocabulary of the business that is going to change? So the two join in the middle in this thing called the data structure model, and that's the process we look at in terms of reversing engineering from the basic operational data and forward engineering from the business terms. Out comes the middle to something that we refer to as a data object. It is an architectural component that helps to define the data. So if we want to look at operational impact analysis then, what we need to look at is, starting with this data object, how do we now start to connect it to all the other elements within the operational environment? And then from there, we can take the data and start connecting it to the applications, the physical network, the life cycle to see how data changes over time, and the security systems. So now what we do is we take a similar type of situation, and we want to look now at the impact analysis of these changes. We're going to give you two scenarios to run through today. The first one relates to regulatory compliance, and the specific example we're going to use is the European General Data Protection Regulation. Incidentally, it comes into full force in 268 days, 15 hours, and 28 minutes on the old countdown clock. And we'll go through a description of what that regulation is. But the two elements we want to look at in terms of impact analysis are the notions within the regulation about privacy by design and explicit consent. And the second scenario we'd like to take you through relates to data breaches, about the detection of the breach, the areas, which databases, which data that the hacker is trying to get at, the impact analysis of what things are connected to in terms of that data, but also probably more importantly is the accountability and who needs to be notified in the case of a breach. So the first thing we want to take a look at now is the GDPR, which is in effect as of May 2016, but the European Court of Justice gave companies 2 years until May 2018 before the suits will be brought forward to the Court of Justice. It's about the rights of individuals. Fundamentally, it's data privacy by default. And the interesting one there is grounds for lawful processing, which is a great deal about explicit consent for the use of personal data. And again, the mandatory data breach reporting with a very strict time frame, and all of these have rather significant fines if the breach happens. The fundamental change, however, is the fact that it's not about personal data in systems and data protection. It's about data ownership and control by the rights of the individual. So if you see my little graphic there, you'll see that really that change happens, that the individual, what is called the data subject, now has the copyright for their own material, their own information. So the first thing that happens with GDPR is this notion that data privacy by design. It means that from the point of doing business requirements all the way down to the functional application, that at every step one has to show where privacy has been included in the design. It is in fact the default design process now that must happen as it relates to personally identifiable and sensitive information. And what that actually means then, in a lot of respects, it's about implicit consent. You have to ask somebody's consent for any time you collect or distribute or process that piece of information. Point of fact, if you're something called a data controller, which is the key point at which data is collected, anything that happens downstream from the data you collected, you are also responsible and accountable for. And unlike most of the systems we have today on the web, when a person buys something or downloads some free data or exchanges business cards, there is an implied consent that that information is now usable by the person that did the original collection. That is not so under the new law. So we really have to look at then, how is this data object, the information, the copyright information from the individual, connected to all the different applications that exist in an agency's collection and distribution of data, and then by extension to anything in that value chain. How does that go forward? So really what we're looking at now is similarly to what we did with the data side. We take those data objects that we manage in the Erwin data modeler, and we now have to take a business process perspective by saying, okay, we have to now look at our business processes, and we have to add to it the notion of privacy by design. And as we saw once again replicated in the same idea of architecture, that we have our conceptual model, At the top, our application model, representing the models of the operations, and the system design model in the middle. And what we'll look at here is using the Erwin Agile EA tool to help us do some of that impact analysis. So the first thing we really start with is a set of design principles. And as it related to the SS United States, William Francis Gibbs, he had seen what had happened to the SS Normandy in New York Harbor during the war. This great, beautiful, attributed to be one of the most beautiful ships ever made, burn in the harbor. So one of his fundamental design principles was there would be no wood on the SS United States. In fact, if you've ever seen some of the furniture that come off the ship, it was mostly done with aluminum and plastics because, of course, it was the 60s. Oh, and by the way, there were actually 2 pieces of wood on the ship. The French chef in the a la carte restaurant demanded that he still have his wooden cutting board and his wooden-handled knife. So I'd like to pass it over to Jeff now, and we can speak a bit to what enterprise architecture means within this context.
Thanks, Don. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about how the Erwin EA product relates back to some of the ideas and concepts that Don has expressed up to this point. And one of the things that he did talk about was this whole idea of motivation. Why are we doing this? Or what is its purpose? Well, that all starts with understanding what your organization's principles, policies, and goals are. So really what we're looking at here is this notion that you've got a set of principles, and then those principles really manifest themselves into a set of goals. And then those goals are actually realized through policies. And then policies beget the rules and the regulations and the standards around which you're going to do things in your organization. So this pictorial representation here is how we would depict those principles, policies, goals, and other motivation objects like drivers, etc. So this is the whole motivation for why we're doing it. But as Don also mentioned, there is this concept of a capability. So as we drive down, we're really looking at what are the business capabilities. Now, we can look at the business capabilities from two perspectives. The first perspective is what business capabilities do we currently have today, and then what business capabilities do we need in order to be compliant with regulations. So the idea here is we need to do some analysis of these capabilities. And a capability is really just a set of functions with sub-functions from a business perspective. And if you look at this slide in the upper left-hand corner, there's something called a smart query. What a smart query is a way to basically set up an analysis question and then color-code it through heat maps to various artifacts within the EA structure. So if we look at this capability here, what we're really trying to find out is which business functions are associated with high-risk data. That will help call out the functions that we need to actually take a look at. So once we've analyzed that, we can now start to look at the processes. Now, data is a natural byproduct of a process, because a process is essentially the work that we do. It's what we do every day. So we need to say, okay, which business processes actually create new data? And which business processes actually read that data? In the old days, we would call this CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. But essentially, when we're looking at this, using that same smart query process, what we're really doing here is saying, which business processes are associated with the high-risk data? So we've gone from the function down to the actual process itself. So we're driving down. So as Don talked about things from a conceptual level, that getting down into the plans, and then operational level, that's kind of what we're doing here is we're drilling down from a function to a specific process. And we're analyzing this process, and we're using that same heat map concept. So here you can see the two items with a yellow stripe indicate that these processes are ones we need to take a look at because they do deal with personal information, sensitive information, or kind of information that is critical to the business. Now, we can identify the processes that might contain risky data. We can associate that with what capabilities, functions we have. But, of course, we only have so many resources in the organization, and we only have so much money and so much time. So what we really need to do is to say, okay, I know that these processes are dealing with critical information, but how well are they running? So if a process is running poorly, we can actually mark that. And we could say, well, this is a candidate for a process improvement project at some point. But we can also now look and say, well, if you have a purple stripe and a yellow stripe, well, then that actually sets you up a little bit higher. So when I'm trying to figure out what kind of projects are we going to put together for the next coming year, I can use this analysis to help me address that. Now, the next couple of slides have to do specifically with something called ArchiMate notation. So for those people that might not be familiar with this, I'm just going to take a quick moment to talk about it. It's essentially a notation style used to express enterprise architecture. It's really classified into three specific areas: a business, an application, and technology area. And each one of those areas represents different artifacts that can be expressed on a model. So as I go through the next few slides, I'll be pointing to these kinds of symbols to represent core concepts and ideas within this EA. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is the application to process analysis. Here, which business processes are associated with what applications? So when we're looking at this here, understanding what business processes are is really just talking about what work we do. Now that work can be divided up into work that a machine does, and that machine could be a software machine, and what kind of work does an actual human being do. So in this view, what we're doing is we're saying we have a process. That process is actually executed by a particular application that might have some business logic encapsulated in it in the form of some component idea. So when we're looking at this, we're really just saying, okay, well, we have a data artifact. That data artifact is associated with a process, but that process is actually executed by these applications. So here we're just looking at application and process. Here we're now looking at the process, the data, and the system analysis. So this is really the intersection of what process or work do we do, what data is generated by that work or needed by that work, and what kind of systems might collect the information, manipulate the information, and store the information. So here, the important thing to understand is the complexity of the processes. If you look at closely, you'll see that there's a customer concept down here at the bottom, a customer data object. That's really referencing three processes. But then there's another process that's referencing one of the processes that collects and consumes customer information. So when we look at this, we really have to look at the scope of not just exactly which process is working on what critical data elements or critical risky pieces of information, but what processes actually interface with those processes. So the scope can begin to grow because certain applications that we don't think are in scope really are in scope simply by looking at the complexity of the intersections of the processes, the data, and the systems. Now expanding on this a little bit more, we're really looking into customer in a little bit more detail here. So those of you who might be data architects and familiar with an entity and an attribute, this is a similar idea, and that customer is the subject, that would be the area in blue, followed by all the characteristics of a customer, which are really the entities and its attributes. But looking along the sides, we have a little orange stripe. The orange stripe, of course, indicates that of all of this information, these 5 elements are what we generally refer to as critical data elements. That is, if we do not monitor and manage this information, we could find ourselves running afoul of GDPR or something else. So we're looking at how all of this stuff really begins to relate. Another part of the GDPR regulation, as Don mentioned before, is where is the information collected, where is the information processed, and where is the information ultimately stored. Those are critical pieces of the GDPR that we need to understand. So we need to introduce this concept of a location. So as Don talked about this in his idea, he talked about it as place. So this is place. And we are really just trying to figure out where the information is collected, where is it stored, because all of that stuff is directly relatable to the GDPR. So this takes us to the section on the data breach, so I'm going to pass it back to Don at this point.
Thank you, Jeff. So the second scenario we wanted to look at was related to data breaches, particularly when, as we start to see information that is now coming through a hacker getting into our systems, we now know it's really a question of not if it's going to happen, but when it's going to happen. And the new acronym that's been created for that is something called the Advanced Persistent Threat. In fact, you see the statistic down at the bottom there. When queried, CEOs said that really 2/3 of the Canadian companies surveyed were saying that really the war on cybercrime, they're not winning right now. So it's really a lot about data security and data protection. But when things do go wrong, what's the first thing one does? Of course, in the case of the Titanic, is go get the blueprints. And this is something, again, we want to talk about in our second scenario now, because in the first one, we looked more from a top-down perspective, saying that, well, we do want to change the way we do business because of things like GDPR. But let's look at the other way around. Let's look at the real operational world, and there's something not going right down there. How do we do that level of traceability? Again, let's start with the blueprints. So as we mentioned, the data architecture being the foundation of enterprise architecture, we need to look to our technical blueprints, and they are coming from our data management systems. In fact, they are our data models. These are the architectural diagrams that form the basic structure of our data architecture. So now what we want to take a look at, similarly again to the previous discussion, is we want to do some forensic work now. We found that the interaction happened and the hackers were after some information that is in one of our databases somewhere, and we're trying to collect and sell that information to someone else. So once again, starting with the data architecture, we look to our data modeling tool, and then we go try to find the operational data, reverse engineer that, back up to our logical models to see where, again, we have created these data objects. We can now take those data objects, and we can now go to try to find the applications that were associated with the data object. Very often, the way a data breach happens, it actually comes through the application itself, that somehow someone from outside the organization, or frankly sometimes even internal to the organization, has found a way to breach the firewall, to breach the security system or the data protection system by access through an application. So it's very critical to understand in that sense then how the operation of those applications relates to the data, but more importantly, what are the security precautions, who is allowed to look at the data, and in fact, where are those applications going to be found on the physical network? Jeff?
Thanks, Don. So previously, I talked about this whole idea of having a motivation of why we're going to do something. So we've got our principles, which ultimately become policies and rules and regulations. That's a top-down view of the enterprise. Now we're actually taking a look at sort of a bottom-up view, and we're really looking at actual hardware assets. So if we look here at this diagram in the center there's a concept of a node, and this node can be referenced by a hardware server. And then that hardware server may have an instance of a software server. And that software server may have an instance of an actual database which stores information from the data model that Don was talking about previously. So when we're looking at it from this sort of a higher level perspective, the EA perspective, we're saying, okay, what hardware asset contained that information? And then we also need to know what application or applications might be associated with that database. So now we're really trying to tie back the physical applications with the physical data assets and the location at which the information is stored, because that all becomes important to us to try to find out this where the breach occurred, number one. But number two, who has to be notified? I mean, who's actually responsible for customer data or product data, et cetera? Because within the GDPR, there's actually a time frame from which a breach occurs to the time at which the customer or, let's say, the persons affected have to be notified. So we need to know not only what's the hardware asset that contains the database that the application talks to, but we also have to look at that data object and say that that data object is also related back to a business process. So a person or a particular organization might be responsible for that process, which might be related to that capability or function. So looking there at the bottom, we have different roles played by folks in the organization. We have a data steward role, and then there's a stakeholder role. So we need to know, how does this stuff actually propagate to the actual individual who is responsible for the data and thus responsible for perhaps the notification part. So at this point, I'll hand it back to Don.
Thank you. So as Jeff had mentioned, we're starting to look at now some associations that we have seen from the information that we're collecting from our enterprise architecture. And we want to take a look at the notion of architectural accountability then as it relates to governance. So what we want to see here is we're going back to the association model that says we want to look at how, at a conceptual level, the data, the product of the organization, whether it's the final product or the work product, is connected to a specific process that if we go back again to our information engineering, we know that it is created, reviewed, updated, or deleted by a process. But by the same token, going back for some of the management theory we've seen from over the years, that we have this notion that any given party in an organization or the organization itself, as it relates to a work product or final product, has some either a responsibility and accountability, is consulted or informed when they're actually relating to that piece of information. So if we start to look at it now, we can glean the information from the enterprise architecture tools, and we can bring it down to something as simple as a spreadsheet as we see here, and we find that the number of relationships that exist then between the process, in this case we want to see what creates the data, and similarly we can take a look at the other representation of the accountability, which is which party is then accountable for that process. So now as we start to build these two things, we know, of course, from our good friend Pythagoras, that if we take the data, look at the CRUD to the process, and we take the RACI, the responsibility accountability to the process, and we take the common axis of process, and we see now that we look at the common relationships, we can start to glean from the enterprise architecture then some of the notions of the data stewardship. So in this particular case, as an example, we are looking at the party that is accountable for the process that creates the data. So if we follow that line along from data to process to party, we now look at the relationship now of party back to the data. And again, we probably found a person that is accountable likely for the creation of that data, in fact, the data steward. So we can now take the information that's from that model. Because it's an associative model rather than a hierarchical model, we can start to build these different associations to try and get more information about our entire enterprise. So as we look at the enterprise scale then, we start with our data model, and again, we said that as the foundation to enterprise architecture, and one of the questions had come up about what is the foundation of a data architecture. Well, hopefully you've seen now that that is a series of abstractions or models that relate to the conceptual models of the data or the information in an organization, which is typically done at a more atomic level for things like customers and products. And then we move down through the logical data models, which are more about the systems that are being created to manage the data, and reverse engineering the actual physical databases. Associated with that, of course, is the notion that that can only happen when there is good data management. So it's a data governance process of the fundamental core models of the data architecture that become that foundation for EA. And I hope you've seen then, if we start to now connect the data architectures to the security and network architectures, and frankly the system architectures, which is how data and application are interrelated, and then provide that in a way that you can then do impact analysis and sensitivity analysis across the entire enterprise. So, what have we talked about today? Well, again, hopefully you've seen a bit of what our offerings provide in terms of the notion of governing architectures and having it from this enterprise perspective. And as we start to look at it, the strong data foundation really is the way to start with your enterprise architecture activities, and we want to understand the impact of change, reducing risk, and achieving compliance. And understanding change that comes from the data perspective, we believe, is a good place to start. In fact, how do you get started? Well, we believe the first place to get started, like any time you've ever entered a mall for the first time, is to go to that mall map. We think a really good map of the functional areas related to data architecture and good data management can be found in the CMMI's model of the data maturity model. And that provides a guidance or a framework as to how to achieve high levels of maturity and competency in the management of those data architectures. But of course, the second most important thing about a mall is not only the mall map, but if you've ever been to someplace like the Mall of Americas, it's huge. The most important thing is understanding where you are. And that's that little gold star you see. But just as important as knowing where you are, you really have to have a sense of the principles and policies of where you want to get to. Having that conceptual knowledge of the business and how that's going to stream through the different architectures you build. And of course, the last thing is understanding what they call in the mall business wayfinding. How do you get there? Well, we hope that the DMM assessment which we perform, which is that leveling of levels 1 through 5 that we alluded to earlier, happens from an assessment that then helps you provide you with that roadmap of how to get there. The strong foundation, we feel, comes from a combination of people, processes, and technologies. And we, Sandhill Consultants, obviously form the people component. The process component is the DMM model, we feel is a very strong framework. But equally important, of course, is the technologies that we use to help automate the processes. And as we deal with the Erwin vision, as I mentioned, going from purely a data modeling company to more of an enterprise architecture company is the vision for the future based on this strong foundation of metadata that passes across from the business process, modeling, the enterprise architecture, the data modeling, data governance, and, of course, the collaboration to provide that to happen. So the common modeling platform is part of the Erwin vision going forward. And for us, as I mentioned, we're very strong supporters and partners with the CMMI Institute, and we believe that, again, the strong data architecture as the foundation comes from a governance, a strong strategy, quality, architecture itself, and then the operations. But we feel it's the modeling aspect within Sandhill Consultants' offerings that help you achieve that. In governance, we have the structure modeling, the basic metadata. In the strategy, it's understanding the functional models, the capability models, the guidance that you're going to provide to the data architecture. In quality, it's really the content we're talking about here, and it's qualification of the content against the structures. Operations, again, we speak to the life cycle of the data, and it has to come from a strong set of standards within your architecture to achieve that. So, what we saw today was a bit of the Agile EA product. And if you are interested in some more information on that, please contact Robert at the email you see below you. And, of course, we'll be connecting you to the website where you can see more about Erwin EA. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time today. And please, if you have any more questions, let us know.
Thank you very much, Donald and Jeffrey. At this point in time, we're going to move on to questions from the viewers today. And if you have a question but haven't asked it yet, this is your opportunity. So diving right in, first question, how can I really get a feel for my data management maturity level?
There is a notion of self-assessment, but we feel that it's important to have a more empirical view. The CMMI methodology was brought together 20, 30 years ago to look at the software development process and to provide much more of that empirical view, and again, the famous 1 to 5 scale. The number became very important at the end point, but we feel with the DMM, we actually look at all 26 areas of the process for doing data management, and we actually do assessments that are sanctioned by the CMMI to provide you with the method and the structured workshop process to understand which level you are at in all the 26 major areas of data management.
Understood. On to our next question. How do you import a data object into Agile EA?
I think I'll give that one to Jeff.
There's a couple of different approaches. The Erwin Agile EA product has actually been customized so they can actually directly import an Erwin model into the enterprise architecture and actually manifest it as an entity with attributes. The other approach is to use something like a CSV file. So let's say, for instance, you might have another modeling tool or another product. You can actually use a CSV file in Excel and then import that metadata into the tool. And during the import process, you can actually map it to the related artifacts. So if I'm talking about, let's say, entities and attributes, I could relate those things to data objects, which is what we did during this presentation. But you could also relate it back to a business role. You could relate it back to just about anything you want within the tool. So you can import it, or you can directly open Erwin in the Agile EA product.
Understood. Thanks, Jeffrey. Next question, how does GDPR apply to my U.S. company?
Well, there's two parts to this. I'll handle the physical location part, and I'll let Don handle the other part. One of the things about the GDPR that's kind of an interesting thing is that if the transaction happens in, let's say, the United States, but the data is actually stored in the EU, that data is subject to that to the regulation. So when we did the presentation, I noted that it was important to understand the location as to where the data is collected, where the data is processed, and ultimately where the data is stored. Don, do you have anything to add to that?
Other than the fact that, as we discussed, the GDPR notion of private and personal information and the copyright have said that we are dealing with individual identifiable persons of a U.S., an EU member state. Now the question comes up again is that now about where does that person transact the data, but it does relate to the fact that as it relates to consent, if a person is a member of an EU state, in the interaction with data, there has to be explicit consent. The question is now going to become, is it happen anywhere that that person is, or is it only when they're in a EU member state? That one will be determined presumably through some legal processing within the year or so. But fundamentally, if your company deals with any members, individual persons from a EU member state, you will be covered by the regulations.
Understood. Our next question, how different is Erwin as compared to the open group architecture framework model?
I believe that one question. I'll just go ahead, Jeff. You can take that one.
I will try to speak up. I've heard that I'm a little faint here, but essentially the Erwin EA tool uses the ArchiMate notation to do the diagrams and symbol relationships, but it actually is based on the TOGAF framework. So the different TOGAF perspectives are managed through the diagram. So the associations, all the linkages are really subject to those different, motivation perspective, implementation perspective, et cetera. That's how it manages it. Now, this isn't to say that you have to use TOGAF in order to work with a tool. As Don mentioned, there's also Zachman, there's FIF, there's TIF, there's DODAF, there's all kinds of different frameworks out there. It's just that out of the box, the ArchiMate and TOGAF frameworks are supported, but you can use any kind of approach to your EA that you'd like.
Understood. Our next question, does Erwin offer a solution that can expose data lineage by integrating with existing ETL tools?
To the best of my knowledge right now, there is no real lineage between, let's say, a data model and ETL process and, transformations. You could, of course, do it, modeling it out using the EA tool because essentially extract is a process, transforms a process, loads a process. But there aren't any that I'm aware of.
Right, and again, it's a question of what comes out of the box. We have worked with some of our clients to actually build some of that information through the data modeling tool, not so much the enterprise architecture tool, but going back to the data modeling tool through the use of the API to actually start to create the information from there. So what we've done there is more of a consulting product engagement that we have built that would go to the person's individual EA tool, bring out the information. The lineage today just shows the physical movement, and obviously it needs to be more than that because you need to show any sort of business rule change that happened there. So the tool itself is direct. It just shows you the physical data movement. However, again, we have worked with our clients to help them enhance it by adding the business rules they've discovered from the ETL tool.
Understood. On to our next question. To achieve a CMMI high maturity level in an organization, would a certified CMM practice leader or two be suggested, or should an entire organization be certified or at least CMMI trained?
That's a very, very good question. We start off with the notion that you need to have a CMMI certified assessor come in to do the job, and that person is known as an EDME, and in fact I happen to be one. Beyond that, the important part again is to socialize the results of the assessment to your specific organization. So if we start to look at it again to the myriad of processes that are there, as you start to look at if you're at a level 1, which is typically more project-based, the pattern typically goes from a project to a higher level at a program level, and that's typically done in a line of business or in a specific application area where the information is brought together. What we do when we do the assessments is not only do we do the workshops to physically assess the position, but we also look for a library to be built of work products. So for example, if you're at a level 1 and there's this wonderful piece of things that are happening in one project, what we do in that transition from level 1 to level 2 is to try to bring that work product as an example to grow it through the organization. So it is very, very much dependent on the culture of the specific organization of how we interpret the results and the pattern. And another example, of course, is there may be things you need to get to level 3 a lot quicker that you may only be at a level 1. So, conventional logic would say, well, take your 2.5, get them to 3. But you may find through discussions with the business organization, again, around things like compliance and regulatory things, that you may have to get certain aspects like data quality to a level 3 much quicker than you would have if you just followed a standard natural process. So I guess what I'm saying, it's adapting the format of the assessment from this empirical review and then matching it with the goals and capabilities to get you to the level you need to be at as quickly as we can.
Understood. On to our next question. Does Erwin data modeling tools support graph models, non-SQL databases, columnar databases, etc.? And a follow-up question of the same nature, do you support big data stencils?
Well, there is a module within the Erwin framework that does cater to the NoSQL concept, so that would include things like Mongo and Cassandra and some of these other ideas. As far as the stencils go for big data, the meta model for the Agile Erwin EA product is completely extensible. So you can create an object that is representative of that. To the best of my knowledge, at this point in time, we're up to the ArchiMate 3.0 representation, and I'm not sure how much of that has big data stuff in it, but you're not limited by just what's in ArchiMate. You can say, I want to create a new object. This object is of type. Define the type, add some attributes to that type, and then associate that with other things.
Understood, and we have time for one more question. What is the future roadmap of integrating Erwin EA tool and Erwin modeling tool?
I'll take a stab at that one. The whole notion behind this is the fact that there is this foundation to which all the tools will be connected. There are obviously some of the tools, such as the business process modeling tool and the current data modeling tool, that will be connected to this data foundation. And effectively what it is an enterprise architecture meta model. And it's that meta model that becomes the foundation for all the future tools that will be joined from the Erwin perspective. And that includes the new tools that are coming along and the ones that are currently within the group of tools that come from the Erwin world, and as probably you're aware, come from the Casewise world as well.
Right. So from an end user perspective, what it will look like is one standard user interface. You won't know that you're changing from a data modeling application to an EA application to a BPMN application. There'll just be different visualizations of the idea through a web interface. So it'll look like one modeling environment for different aspects of modeling that you do.
Understood. That is all the time we have for questions today. We apologize that we were unable to get to all your questions, but as I stated earlier, all questions will be answered via email. I'd like to thank our speakers today, Donald Sulsby, Vice President, Architecture Strategies at Sandhill Consultants, and Jeffrey Giles, Principal Architect at Sandhill Consultants. If you would like to review this presentation or send it to a colleague, please use the same URL that you used for today's live event. It will be archived, and you will receive an email tomorrow once the archive is posted. Now, as we stated earlier, just for participating in today's event, someone would win a $100 American Express gift card, and the winner today is Molly Peterson. Molly, we will be in touch via email so you can claim your prize. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.